The amber glow of street lamps cast long shadows across Maple Street as October 18, 2003, crept past the witching hour. At 3:47 a.m., the silence of Grand Rapids' most prestigious neighborhood was shattered by the wailing of fire engines racing toward a Victorian mansion that had stood as a monument to American success for over a century. But tonight, 428 Maple Street was dying. Firefighter Captain Mike Rodriguez was the first to breach the front door, his helmet light cutting through smoke so thick it seemed solid. The heat hit him like a physical blow, but something else made him pause in the doorway, and wrongness that went beyond the typical chaos of a house fire. The flames were too controlled, too recent. The smoke still carried the acrid smell of gasoline mixed with something far more sinister. As Rodriguez and his team advanced through the smoke-filled hallway, their lights revealed a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the study, slumped over an antique mahogany desk, was Dr. Robert Brennan, 42, his white dental coat stained with something darker than Upstairs in the master bedroom, they found Linda Brennan, 39, her silk nightgown torn, her carefully manicured nails caked with what looked suspiciously like blood and tissue. But it was the discovery in the third bedroom that stopped the seasoned firefighters cold. 16-year-old Emma Brennan lay on her bed, her violin prodigy fingers still clutching the sheets, her young face peaceful despite the violence that had clearly preceded her death. And there, placed with ceremonial precision on her chest, was a single white rose, pristine, untouched by smoke or flame, as if someone had laid it there moments before the fire began. Rodriguez would later tell investigators that he'd fought fires for 23 years, had seen bodies burn beyond recognition, had pulled children from wreckage that would break most people's souls, but he'd never encountered a scene where death had been so methodically arranged, so deliberately staged. The fire hadn't killed the Brennans, it had been set to hide their murders. As the flames were brought under control and the smoke began to clear, another detail emerged that sent chills through the responding officers. Every family photograph in the house, wedding pictures, vacation snapshots, Emma's school portraits had been turned face down, as if someone couldn't bear to look at the happiness they were about to destroy, or perhaps couldn't bear to have the dead watch what came next. The killer had spent hours in this house after committing triple murder, moving through rooms where blood was still wet, arranging this macabre tableau with the precision of someone who understood exactly how crime scenes were processed. They knew the fire would destroy DNA evidence, knew that water damage from firefighting efforts would contaminate what flames couldn't reach. But they had made one mistake: that pristine white rose, placed with such care on Emma's body, would become the key that eventually unlocked 20 years of secrets, obsession, and the darkest kind of love. To understand the depth of evil that visited 428 Maple Street, you must first understand what the Brennans represented to Grand Rapids. They were the embodiment of the American dream perfected, a family so flawlessly constructed that neighbors would pause during evening walks just to glimpse them through their front windows, as if witnessing a living Norman Rockwell painting. Robert Brennan had built his dental practice from nothing, transforming a single-chair operation into the most prestigious cosmetic dentistry clinic in West Michigan. His patients included judges, business leaders, and local celebrities who trusted him not just with their smiles but with their secrets. Robert's hands, steady and precise, had crafted thousands of perfect smiles, had rebuilt confidence along with crowns and veneers. Linda Brennan was Grand Rapids society personified. She organized charity galas that raised hundreds of thousands for children's hospitals, served on the boards of 3 nonprofits, and volunteered at the local food bank every Tuesday morning. Her calendar was a masterpiece of social orchestration, book clubs, wine tastings, and fundraising committees that kept her busy from dawn until well past dinner. But it was Emma who truly set the Brennans apart from ordinary family. At 16, she possessed a musical talent that left audiences speechless and critics reaching for superlatives they rarely used. Her violin sang with the voice of someone 3 times her age, carrying emotional depth that seemed impossible in someone who hadn't yet experienced heartbreak, loss, or true suffering. She was destined for Juilliard, for Carnegie Hall, for a life that would inspire other young musicians for generations. Yet beneath this veneer of perfection, cracks had begun to show in the months before that October 9. Robert's practice was under federal audit for prescribing patterns that had caught the attention of the DEA. Patients were receiving unusually high amounts of painkillers following routine procedures, and investigators were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about whether Dr. Brennan was running a pill mill disguised as a dental clinic. Linda's prescription medication use had escalated dramatically over the past year. What had started as occasional Xanax for social anxiety had evolved into a daily cocktail of benzodiazepines and sleep aids that left her floating through days in a pharmaceutical haze. Her friends noticed the change, the way she would lose track of conversations mid-sentence, the slight slur in her words by afternoon. Emma, meanwhile, was suffocating under the weight of her parents' expectations and their carefully choreographed version of her future. Her best friend, Jessica Morrison, would later reveal to investigators that Emma had been secretly dating someone her parents had explicitly forbidden her to see. More than that, she had been planning to audition for colleges her parents hadn't approved, dreaming of a life that belonged to her rather than to their vision of what she should become. The last normal day, October 17, Emma performed with the youth orchestra at the homecoming football game, her violin soaring over the marching band as her parents beamed from the bleachers. Robert had his arm around Linda, both of them radiating pride as their daughter's music filled the autumn air. But as the final notes faded and the crowd dispersed, none of them could have known they had less than 8 hours left together, 8 hours before someone would transform their perfect family portrait into a crime scene that would haunt investigators for 2 decades. The forensic reconstruction of that October night reads like sheet music written in blood, each movement building toward a crescendo of violence that would leave 3 lives extinguished and a community forever changed. Detective Janet Kowalski would spend years studying the timeline, mapping every minute of terror that unfolded within the walls of. The killing began at 11:30 p.m. in Robert's mahogany-paneled study, where he often retreated after dinner to review patient charts and manage the business side of his practice. The first blow came from behind, a crushing impact to the base of his skull delivered with something heavy and metallic, possibly a golf trophy from the shelf beside his desk. Robert never had a chance to defend himself, never saw his killer's face, never knew why someone had chosen to end his life in the room where he had built his American dream. The blood spatter patterns told a story of rage barely contained. The killer had struck Robert multiple times after the initial fatal blow, venting fury on a man who was already beyond pain. Forensic analysis revealed at least 7 separate impacts, suggesting either someone in the grip of uncontrollable anger, or someone methodically ensuring that Robert Brennan would never wake up. At midnight, exactly 30 minutes later, the killer moved upstairs to the master bedroom where Linda had been sleeping peacefully, aided by her nightly cocktail of prescription medication. The defensive wounds on her arms and hands showed that, unlike her husband, Linda had awakened during the attack. She had fought desperately for her life, her perfectly manicured nails scraping skin from her attacker's face and arms before succumbing to the same brutal blunt force trauma that had killed Robert. The final and most horrific act occurred at 12:45 a.m. in Emma's bedroom. The 16-year-old had been awakened by the sounds of violence below, and physical evidence suggested she had attempted to barricade her door with her dresser. But fear and adrenaline were no match for a determined killer who had already claimed 2 lives and couldn't afford to leave witness. Emma's death was different from her parents'. The DNA evidence under her fingernails, the defensive wounds on her arms, the disturbed state of her room, all painted a picture of a young woman who had fought with every ounce of strength she possessed. More telling were the killer's actions after her death. Emma's body had been carefully arranged on her bed, her hands folded peacefully over her chest, her hair brushed and spread across her pillow like a medieval saint. But the killer's work was far from finished. For the next 2 hours and 30 minutes they remained in the house, moving through rooms where death lingered in the air, methodically staging a scene that would confound investigators for decades. Every family photograph was turned face down with deliberate precision. Personal items were rearranged in ways that seemed random, but would later prove to follow a pattern only the killer understood. Most disturbing was the discovery in Emma's room. Her violin case stood open, but one piece of sheet music was missing from her collection. Pachelbel's Canon in D, the piece she had been rehearsing for regional competition, had vanished. In its place, someone had left a single white rose, not picked from the Brennan's garden, but purchased from a florist, its stem cut at a precise angle, its petals perfect and unblemished. At 3:15 a.m., the killer finally prepared to leave. They doused the first floor with gasoline from a container in the Brennan's garage, creating an accelerant pattern designed to ensure maximum destruction of evidence. The fire was set in multiple locations simultaneously, suggesting someone with knowledge of arson techniques, someone who understood how flames would spread through the Victorian century-old timber frame. As sirens began to wail in the distance, the killer slipped away into the October darkness, leaving behind a symphony of violence that would echo through Grand Rapids for 20 years. They had committed the perfect crime, or so they believed. But perfect crimes, like perfect families, often hide fatal flaws that only time can reveal. Detective Janet Kowalski stood in the charred ruins of what had once been Grand Rapids' most enviable home, watching the morning sun illuminate a crime scene that seemed designed to frustrate investigators at every turn. Steam still rose from the blackened timbers where firefighters had battled the blaze for 3 hours, and the acrid smell of smoke mixed with something far more sinister, the unmistakable odor of accelerated death. Kowalski had worked homicide for 12 years, had processed crime scenes that would give most people nightmares for life, but she had never encountered a murder staged with such calculated precision, such intimate knowledge of how forensic investigations were conducted. The killer hadn't just committed triple homicide, they had orchestrated the systematic destruction of evidence, with the expertise of someone who understood exactly what detectives would be looking for. The fire had consumed potential fingerprints on door handles, light switches and furniture. The intense heat had degraded DNA evidence that might have been left on clothing or bedding. The water used to extinguish the flames had washed away trace evidence, blood spatter patterns and any footprints the killer might have left in their way. Even the accelerant used to start the fire had been chosen strategically, regular gasoline rather than a more exotic fuel that might be traced to a specific purchase. But arson investigators could still read the story the flames told. The burn patterns revealed multiple points of origin, all on the first floor, all designed to create maximum destruction, while leaving enough of the upper level intact for the bodies to be discovered. This wasn't the work of someone trying to hide their crimes entirely. This was someone who wanted the murders found, but wanted the evidence destroyed. The first suspects emerged as Kowalski began mapping the Brennan family's complicated relationships. Robert Brennan was being sued by a former patient, Marcus Webb, who claimed that a botched root canal had left him with permanent nerve damage and chronic pain. Webb had been increasingly vocal about his anger, posting negative reviews online and threatening to make that quack pay for what he did to me. More troubling was the rumor that Linda Brennan had been having an affair. Several neighbors mentioned seeing a black sedan in the Brennan driveway on afternoons when Robert was at work, always gone before he returned home. The driver was described as a middle-aged man well-dressed, someone who clearly belonged in the neighborhood, but whose identity remained frustratingly elusive. Then there was Tyler Nash. The 19-year-old boyfriend Emma's parents had forbidden her to see. Tyler came from the wrong side of Grand Rapids, the son of a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep their apartment. His record showed minor drug possession, truancy and the kind of petty criminal behavior that wealthy parents use to justify their prejudice. When investigators learned that Emma had been planning to defy her parents and continue seeing Tyler, he became their primary focus. Tyler's alibi initially seemed solid. He claimed to have been at work until midnight, then gone home to his apartment where his mother could vouch for his presence. But when investigators pressed deeper, cracks began to appear. His supervisor at the auto parts store couldn't account for Tyler's whereabouts during the final 2 hours of his shift. Security cameras showed him leaving through the back door at 10:15 p.m., not midnight as he'd claimed. More damning was the witness, who placed Tyler in the Maple Street neighborhood around 11 p.m. on October 17. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, walking her elderly dog on his final outing of the night, was certain she had seen Tyler's distinctive motorcycle parked 3 blocks from the Brennan house. When confronted with this information, Tyler's story changed. First claiming he had been visiting another girlfriend, then insisting he had been driving around aimlessly because he was upset about Emma. The community's response to the murders reflected their inability to process such violence occurring in their sanctuary of wealth and privilege. If the Brennans' perfect, successful, beloved, could be slaughtered in their own home, then no one was safe. Security system sales skyrocketed and neighborhood watch programs formed overnight. Parents began walking their children to school and checking their locks multiple times before bed. But Detective Kowalski sensed something deeper than random violence or simple criminal motivation. The turned-down photographs, the missing sheet music, the pristine white rose. These details spoke of someone with an intimate connection to the family,
someone who knew their routines, their relationships, their secret. The killer hadn't just wanted the Brennans dead. They had wanted to send a message, whose meaning remained frustratingly hidden in the ashes of Fort. As the investigation deepened beyond the charred remains of the Brennan house, Detective Kowalski began uncovering a family whose perfect facade had concealed fractures that ran soul deep. The American dream that Robert and Linda had constructed so carefully was built on foundations far shakier than anyone had imagined. And their secrets were about to spill into the harsh light of criminal investigation. Robert Brennan's gambling addiction had been a masterpiece of concealment, while his patients saw a steady-handed dentist who epitomized professional success. Robert had been living a double life that would have destroyed everything he'd worked to build. Casino records revealed losses exceeding $200,000 over the past 18 months. Money hemorrhaged at poker tables in Detroit, at racetracks across Michigan, and through online betting sites that had consumed his nights after his family went to sleep. The federal audit of his practice suddenly made terrible sense. Robert had been overprescribing painkillers not to run a pill mill, but to generate cash by selling excess medication to dealers who paid premium prices for legitimate prescription. Each fraudulent prescription had pushed him deeper into a web of criminal activity that would have landed him in federal prison if investigators had lived long enough to uncover the full scope of his crimes. Linda's therapy records, obtained through court order, painted a picture of a woman drowning in her own life. Her therapist's notes described mounting suspicions about Robert's behavior, his frequent absences, the mysterious phone calls that ended when she entered the room. More devastating was Linda's admission that she had been planning to leave her husband. Divorce papers had been drafted, but never filed, held back by her fear of losing everything she'd worked to build. The discovery of Linda's potential affair added another layer of complexity to the investigation. Credit card records showed regular charges at upscale hotels during hours when Robert was at work, always paid for by someone else whose identity remained hidden. Her phone records revealed hundreds of calls to a number registered to a burner phone, calls that lasted hours, calls placed at times when a loving wife should have been thinking about her husband and daughter. Emma's world, as revealed through her partially recovered diary, was far darker than anyone had suspected. The pages that survived the fire told the story of a teenager trapped between her parents' expectations and her own desperate need for independence. Her relationship with Tyler Nash had been more serious than her parents knew. She had been planning to run away with him after graduation, to audition for music schools they hadn't approved, to live a life that belonged to her rather than their carefully orchestrated vision of her future. But the diary also revealed something more troubling. Emma had been receiving anonymous love letters, beautiful handwritten notes that praised her musical talent and expressed devotion that bordered on obsession. The letters had started innocuously enough, compliments on her performances, encouragement for her musical studies, but they had gradually become more personal, more possessive, filled with intimate details about her daily routine that suggested someone was watching her closely. When confronted with Tyler Nash's crumbling alibi, investigators pressed harder, and his story finally collapsed entirely. Tyler admitted he had been near the Brennan house on October 17th, but not to commit murder. He had been planning to convince Emma to elope with him immediately. He had seen the lights on in the house, had watched through windows as the family went about their evening routine, but had lost his nerve and driven away without making contact. More significantly, Tyler provided investigators with information that shifted the entire direction of the case. Emma had told him about the anonymous love letters, had shown him several that she found particularly disturbing. Tyler remembered specific details about the handwriting, elegant, old-fashioned script that looked like something from another century. Emma had been frightened by the letters, but hadn't told her parents because she was afraid they would use them as another reason to control her life even more strictly. The leak of the white rose detail to local media created a media frenzy that complicated the investigation immensely. Copycat threats began appearing, roses left at other homes, placed on car windshields, delivered to businesses with notes claiming the killer would strike again. Detective Kowalski found herself chasing dozens of false leads, while the real killer remained hidden in the chaos they had created. As the first anniversary of the murders approached, Kowalski realized she was investigating not just a triple homicide, but the systematic destruction of a family that had been rotting from within long before the killer ever set foot in their home. The question was no longer who had wanted the Brennans dead. It was which of their many secrets had finally caught up with them in the most violent way possible. By year 3 of the investigation, Detective Janet Kowalski had become a woman possessed. Her colleagues watched with growing concern as she transformed from a methodical investigator into someone who spoke of the Brennan case in terms that bordered on obsession. Her desk was covered with crime scene photographs that she studied like ancient texts, searching for revelations that had eluded everyone else who had examined them. The case had cost Kowalski her marriage. Her husband, David, had tried to be understanding when she worked late nights and weekends, when she brought case files home and spread them across their dining room table like some macabre puzzle. But understanding turned to resentment when she missed their anniversary dinner because of a potential lead, when she forgot their daughter's birthday party because she was interviewing a witness for the 4th time. Janet, 3 people are dead, David had said during their final argument. But you're killing yourself and our family trying to bring them back. She had looked at him with eyes that seemed to focus on something far beyond their kitchen, beyond their life together. They deserve justice, she had whispered. They deserve someone who won't give up. The divorce papers were signed on a Tuesday morning in September, year 4 of the investigation. Kowalski initialed each page methodically, the same way she processed evidence, then returned to her office to study the photographs of Emma Brennan's bedroom for the 1000th time. Her ex-husband was wrong. She wasn't trying to bring the dead back to life. She was trying to give them peace. Kowalski's theory had evolved beyond conventional motives like robbery, domestic violence, or random criminal activity. The turned-down photographs, the missing sheet music, the pristine white rose, these weren't the calling cards of a typical killer. They spoke of someone with an intimate connection to the family, particularly to Emma. Someone who had been watching, planning, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. She interviewed every person in Emma's life with an intensity that made some wonder if she was losing her objectivity. Music teachers, classmates, family friends, even the mailman who delivered to Maple Street. Everyone became a potential suspect in Kowalski's expanding web of investigation. She created relationship maps that covered entire walls of her office, connecting Emma to dozens of people through lines that represented everything from casual acquaintance to deep emotional bonds. Her captain, Frank Morrison, called her into his office monthly to discuss her tunnel vision and suggest she take time off to gain perspective. Each conversation followed the same pattern. Morrison expressing concern, Kowalski insisting she was close to a breakthrough, Morrison warning about the dangers of losing objectivity, Kowalski responding with a variation of the same theme. Captain, 3 people are dead, she would say, unconsciously echoing her ex-husband's words. A 16-year-old girl was murdered in her own bedroom by someone she trusted enough to let into her house. That someone is still out there, probably planning their next move. Tunnel vision. Tunnel vision is all I have left. The annual memorial services became deeply personal events for Kowalski. She attended every one, standing at the back of the church while Emma's classmates spoke about their memories, while community leaders promised that the murders would never be forgotten. But Kowalski wasn't there for remembrance. She was there to watch, to study faces, to look for signs of guilt or knowledge in the crowd of mourners. Her notes from year 5 contain entries that read more like a personal diary than professional documentation. Dreamed about Emma again last night. She was playing violin in her bedroom, but the music was different, sad, like a funeral dirge. When I asked her who killed her, she just kept playing and pointed to the photographs on her dresser, all face down like the crime scene. What is she trying to tell me? Kowalski's colleagues began calling her the ghost detective behind her back, partly because she seemed to haunt the precinct at all hours, and partly because she appeared to be chasing spirits rather than flesh and blood But she didn't care about office gossip or professional reputation. She cared about a family that had been destroyed by someone who understood exactly how to cover their tracks, someone who had walked away from triple murder without leaving a trace. As the case files grew thicker and the leads grew colder, Kowalski clung to her certainty that the killer had made mistakes, small errors that would eventually reveal their identity to someone patient enough to find them. She just had to keep looking, keep studying, keep believing that justice was possible even when everyone else had given up hope. The killer, she was convinced, was still out there, still watching, still waiting, and someday, when they made their next move, Detective Janet Kowalski would be ready. The transformation of the Brennan case from active investigation to cold case file happened gradually, like the changing of seasons that nobody notices, until summer has already become winter. By year 5, Detective Kowalski's daily briefings had become weekly updates, then monthly reviews, then quarterly check-ins that felt more like ritual than investigation. Tyler Nash, once the prime suspect whose motorcycle had been spotted near Maple Street, was finally cleared through DNA evidence that proved conclusively he had never been inside the Brennan house. The skin cells under Emma's fingernails belonged to someone else entirely, someone whose genetic profile existed in no database, matched no known criminal, connected to no person in the system. Tyler moved to California, became an elementary school teacher, and tried to build a life unmarked by the suspicion that had followed him for years. The case became a fixture on national crime shows, each program promising new insights while recycling the same haunting details. America's Most Wanted, Unsolved Mysteries, and a dozen true crime podcasts featured the Brennan murders, generating thousands of tips that led nowhere. Psychics called, claiming visions of the killer. Prisoners in various states confessed to crimes they couldn't have committed. Online sleuths created elaborate theories that connected the murders to everything from organized crime to satanic cults. Detective Kowalski, now carrying the supervisory rank she'd never wanted, still checked the case file monthly. Her new responsibilities meant she couldn't devote the obsessive attention she once had, but the Brennans remained a constant presence in her thoughts. She kept Emma's school photo on her desk, not the crime scene photographs that had once covered every surface, but a picture of the living girl smiling in her orchestra uniform, violin bow raised as if conducting her own destiny. The annual memorial services evolved from community-wide gatherings to intimate affairs, attended mainly by family and close friends. Emma's high school graduated 7 classes of students who had never known her personally, for whom she had become more legend than person. The violin program that bore her name continued to thrive, with each year's best student
receiving the Emma Brennan Memorial Scholarship for Musical Excellence. The house at 4028 Maple Street became Grand Rapids' most infamous address. Rebuilt within 2 years of the murders, it went through 7 different owners in the following decade. Each family arrived with hopes of making the beautiful Victorian their dream home. Each left within months complaining of strange feelings, unexplained sounds, and an atmosphere that seemed perpetually mournful despite the home's elegant restoration. Real estate agents stopped mentioning the property's history, but potential buyers inevitably discovered the truth through internet searches or neighborhood gossip. The asking price dropped steadily as the years passed, but even deeply discounted, the house struggled to find permanent residents. Local teenagers claimed it was haunted by the Brennan family, and more than one vandalism incident involved roses left on the front porch. Cruel pranks that reopened wounds the community tried desperately to heal. Emma's classmates moved on with their lives in the way that young people do, their grief transformed by time into something manageable. They graduated from college, married, started careers, began families of their own, but October 18th remained a day of remembrance for those who had known her personally, a date when they would visit her grave and remember a girl who had been frozen forever at 16, while they aged into adults she would never become. The violin program at Central High School continued Emma's tradition of performing Pachelbel's canon each October 18th, but the missing sheet music from her collection had never been found. Music teachers had to locate new copies, and somehow the performance was never quite the same. The students played technically perfect renditions, but they lacked the emotional depth that Emma had brought to the piece, the indefinable quality that had made listeners believe she was destined for greatness. Robert Brennan's dental practice was eventually sold to a corporate chain that renovated the offices and removed all traces of his personal touch. Linda's charity work was continued by friends who established a foundation in her memory, but the organization struggled to match her passion and organizational skills. The family's contributions to Grand Rapids gradually faded into memory, overwhelmed by the tragedy that had claimed them. As the 15th anniversary approached, Detective Kowalski realized that the Brennan case had become part of the city's permanent landscape, like a monument to the fragility of safety and the persistence of evil. The killer had achieved a perfect crime, walking away from triple murder without consequence, leaving behind only questions that grew colder with each passing year. But Detective Kowalski still believed that perfect crimes, like perfect families, contained the seeds of their own destruction. Someone somewhere knew what had happened on October 8. The dead deserved justice, and Kowalski had promised them she would never stop looking. Some promises she had learned are too important to break, even when keeping them costs everything else you hold dear. The 15th anniversary of the Brennan murders arrived with the kind of autumn chill that reminded longtime Grand Rapids residents of that terrible October night when innocents died alongside 3 members of the city's most prominent family. But 2018 brought something unexpected to the annual memorial service, a revelation that would breathe new life into an investigation many had presumed dead. James Brennan, Robert's younger brother, had never stopped believing that justice was possible. While others had moved on, he had maintained a comprehensive website dedicated to his family's memory, updating it regularly with new information, photos from happier times, and appeals for anyone with knowledge to come forward. The site received hundreds of visits each month from true crime enthusiasts, former patients of Robert's practice, and people who simply couldn't forget the horror of what had happened on Maple Street. Linda's sister, Catherine Walsh, had taken the opposite approach. She had stopped coming to Michigan altogether, finding the annual pilgrimage too painful to bear. Catherine had moved to Arizona shortly after the murders, claiming she needed to escape the constant reminders of loss that seemed to permeate every corner of Grand Rapids. Her absence left a void in the family's remembrance rituals, but those who knew her understood that grief takes different forms in different hearts. The memorial service was smaller than in previous years. Perhaps 30 people gathered in the cemetery where 3 marble headstones bore the names that had once represented everything good about American family life. Emma's best friend, Melissa Rodriguez, had returned with her 8-year-old daughter, a girl who bore a striking resemblance to Emma at that age. As they stood beside Emma's grave, Melissa shared a memory that had been eating at her for 15 years. "There's something I never told the police," Melissa whispered to the small gathering. "Emma had been getting these letters, love letters. I guess you'd call them. They were beautiful but creepy at the same time. She showed me a few of them, and they gave me chills." Melissa reached into her purse and pulled out a plastic bag containing a single sheet of cream-colored paper covered in elegant handwriting. The letter she had kept was unlike anything the investigators had seen. The handwriting was old-fashioned, almost calligraphic, written with what appeared to be a fountain pen rather than a ballpoint. The language was formal, romantic in the style of another century. "My dearest Emma, your music speaks to my soul in ways that words can never express. I find myself counting the hours until I can hear your violin sing again. You are destined for greatness, but you must trust those who understand your gift." Detective Kowalski, now a lieutenant but still attending every memorial service, studied the letter with the intensity of someone who had been waiting 15 years for exactly this kind of breakthrough. The paper felt expensive, substantial in a way that suggested it came from a high-end stationery store rather than a typical office supply chain. More importantly, the handwriting displayed characteristics that could be analyzed, compared, potentially matched to someone's writing sample. Emma was scared of these letters, Melissa continued, tears streaming down her face. She said they made her feel like someone was watching her all the time, but she didn't want to tell her parents because they were already so controlling about her music, about her life. She was afraid they'd use it as an excuse to lock her up even more than they already had. The revelation sent Kowalski's mind racing through 15 years of investigation. Anonymous love letters to a teenage girl suggested someone with access to her daily routine, someone who could observe her closely enough to know her schedule, her habits, her vulnerability. The formal, old-fashioned language implied someone older, someone educated, someone who viewed Emma not as a contemporary but as an object of adult fascination. Back at the precinct, Kowalski began the painstaking process of analyzing the letter's physical characteristics. The paper was high-quality stock, watermarked with a logo that identified it as coming from a specialty stationery company in Detroit. The ink showed characteristics consistent with an expensive fountain pen, the kind used by someone who took writing seriously as an art form. But it was the handwriting itself that proved most intriguing. Computer analysis revealed characteristics that suggested someone trained in formal penmanship, possibly someone educated in an era when beautiful handwriting was considered a mark of refinement and education. The letter appeared to have been written by someone who had learned to write in the 1960s or earlier, someone who had practiced their penmanship until it became a defining characteristic. As Kowalski studied the evidence that had been hidden for 15 years, she realized that the investigation had been focusing on the wrong suspects from the very beginning. Tyler Nash, the disgruntled patient, the mysterious affair partner. None of them fit the profile suggested by this elegant obsessive correspondence. The killer wasn't someone from Emma's world of teenage rebellion and first love. The killer was someone from the adult world of music and education, someone with the authority and access that comes with being trusted by parents and admired by students. Someone Kowalski realized with growing certainty, who had been hiding in plain sight for 15 years, protected by their respectable profession, and the community's inability to imagine that teachers could be predators. The white rose, the missing sheet music, the turned-down family photographs, all of it suddenly made terrible sense when viewed through the lens of someone who believed their obsession with a teenage girl was actually love. Detective Marcus Chen arrived at the Grand Rapids Police Department in January 2020. His toolkit included advanced DNA analysis techniques, artificial intelligence programs that could identify patterns invisible to human investigators, and genealogical databases that had revolutionized the field of forensic investigation. The Brennan case file filled 3 storage boxes, representing 20 years of investigation that had consumed careers and destroyed marriages. Chen approached the evidence with fresh eyes, unencumbered by the assumptions and theories that had guided previous investigators. He started with the physical evidence that had been preserved since 2003, much of it never tested with the advanced techniques now available to law enforcement. The DNA sample from under Emma's fingernails degraded, partial, previously considered unusable, suddenly became viable through new extraction and amplification techniques. The genetic profile that emerged was incomplete but sufficient for comparison purposes. More importantly, it could be run through genealogical databases that contained millions of profiles from people who had submitted DNA for ancestry research, vastly expanding the pool of potential matches beyond the traditional criminal justice system. But it was Chen's analysis of the anonymous love letter that produced the investigation's most shocking breakthrough. The paper and ink that had seemed merely expensive to Detective Kowalski proved to be far more significant when subjected to chemical analysis. The stationery was vintage stock, manufactured by a Detroit company that had gone out of business in 1990. The handwriting analysis that followed relied on artificial intelligence programs that could identify characteristics invisible to human experts. The AI analyzed letter formation, pen pressure, spacing patterns and dozens of other variables to create a unique fingerprint of the writer's style. When Chen ran this analysis through databases of handwriting samples, he expected to come up empty. Handwriting analysis rarely produced definitive matches to unknown suspects. Instead, the AI flagged a match in the most unexpected database imaginable: applications for music education scholarships, submitted to the Grand Rapids Community Foundation. The handwriting analysis indicated a 94% probability that the love letter to Emma Brennan had been written by the same person who had submitted scholarship applications for disadvantaged students seeking music education funding. The applications had been submitted by Jonathan Hartwell, a violin instructor who had taught at several prestigious music schools throughout the region. His scholarship submissions were beautifully written recommendations for students he considered exceptionally talented, written in the same elegant script that had praised Emma's musical gifts in anonymous letters that gradually became more possessive and disturbing. Chen's investigation into Hartwell's background revealed a pattern that should have triggered alarm bells decades earlier. At each school where he taught, Hartwell had developed special relationships with his most talented female students. He offered extra lessons, arranged special performance opportunities, and took unusually personal interest in their musical development. At 2 different institutions, he had left abruptly following complaints about inappropriate conduct, but no formal charges had ever been filed. In Grand Rapids, Hartwell had been Emma Brennan's violin instructor for 3 years, preparing her for auditions at prestigious conservatories and pushing her toward the kind of musical excellence that could have opened doors to a brilliant career. Colleagues remembered his special interest in Emma, his insistence that she had generational talent that required extraordinary nurturing and protection. More disturbing was the timeline Chen constructed of Hartwell's final weeks in Grand Rapids. On October 17, 2003, the day before the murders, school janitor Miguel Santos had witnessed a heated argument between Hartwell and Dr. Robert Brennan in the music department hallway. Santos, whose English was limited and who had been afraid to get involved with police, had never reported the incident, but he remembered Robert Brennan shouting something about keeping away from my daughter, and Hartwell responding with language that was very angry, very bad. The argument,
Chen realized had likely centered on Robert and Linda's decision to reject the European conservatory opportunity that Hartwell had arranged for Emma, rather than recognizing their daughter's talent and supporting her musical education. The Brennans had decided to keep Emma closer to home, to maintain control over her future in ways that would have frustrated and enraged someone who believed he understood her potential better than her own parents. When Czech authorities raided Hartwell's small apartment in Prague, they discovered a shrine to Emma Brennan that defied comprehension. Photographs of her performing, recordings of her playing violin, programs from every concert she had ever participated in, all carefully preserved and displayed like religious artifacts. Most chilling was the framed sheet music mounted on his bedroom wall. Pachelbel's Canon in D, the piece that had disappeared from Emma's music collection on the night she died. The technology that had once seemed like science fiction had finally caught up with a killer who had believed his crime was perfect. But as Detective Chen prepared for Hartwell's extradition from the Czech Republic, he realized that solving the case would only begin the process of healing a community that had lived with unanswered questions for 20 years. Justice, he knew, would never be able to restore what had been lost, but it might finally allow the dead to rest in peace. Jonathan Hartwell, now 67 years old, had spent 20 years constructing a new life in the Czech Republic, far from the scene of his crimes and the families he had destroyed. In the picturesque town of Český Krumlov, he taught private violin lessons to wealthy tourist children and local prodigies, his reputation built on claims of having trained internationally renowned American musicians, whose names he never specified. His Czech neighbors knew him as a cultured expatriate who lived modestly in a small apartment overlooking the Vltava River. He spoke fluent Czech, attended classical concerts religiously, and was regarded as a harmless eccentric who had chosen artistic fulfillment over material success. They had no idea that their quiet music teacher was a fugitive from justice, who had murdered 3 people to possess the object of his obsession. The raid on Hartwell's apartment revealed the depth of his delusion and the systematic nature of his predatory behavior. Local police, working with American investigators, discovered a meticulously organized collection of materials related to Emma Brennan that had been accumulated over 2 decades of exile. Photographs of her performances were arranged chronologically, from her earliest recitals as a child, through her final concert, just days before her death. More disturbing were the audio recordings, dozens of hours of Emma playing violin captured during lessons and practice sessions, using equipment she had never known existed. Hartwell had been recording her for years, building a library of her musical development that allowed him to relive her performances whenever he chose. His computer contained hundreds of files labeled with dates and pieces, organized with the obsessive precision of someone who regarded these recordings as his most precious possession. The investigation into Hartwell's background revealed a pattern of predatory behavior that stretched back to his earliest teaching positions. As a child prodigy himself, Hartwell had been marked for greatness until a scandal at the conservatory, where he studied, had derailed his performing career. Details were scarce. Records from the 1970s had been destroyed or lost, but colleagues remembered whispers about inappropriate relationships and a promising career that had ended abruptly. His teaching positions throughout the Midwest had followed a similar path. Hartwell would arrive with impeccable credentials and glowing recommendations, quickly establishing himself as an instructor who could identify and nurture exceptional talent. But within a few years, complaints would begin surfacing about his special attention to female students, his insistence on private lessons at unusual hours, and his tendency to develop unhealthy attachments to the most talented girls in his program. At each institution, Hartwell had managed to leave before formal charges could be filed. School administrators, concerned about scandal and liability, had typically negotiated quiet departures that allowed him to move on to new positions without criminal records that would have prevented him from teaching elsewhere. The system had failed to protect students by allowing a predator to simply relocate when his behavior became too obvious to ignore. In Grand Rapids, Hartwell had finally found his perfect victim. Emma Brennan possessed not only extraordinary musical talent, but also the kind of trusting nature that made her vulnerable to adult manipulation. For 3 years, he had groomed her systematically, convincing her that their relationship was special, that he alone understood her potential, that her parents' concerns about his influence stemmed from their inability to appreciate her gift. The argument with Robert Brennan on October 17th had shattered Hartwell's carefully constructed fantasy. When Emma's parents rejected the European conservatory opportunity he had arranged, They weren't just limiting their daughter's musical education, they were destroying his access to her, ending the relationship that had become the center of his existence. The recordings found in Hartwell's apartment included his own voice, captured as he spoke to Emma during lessons with an intimacy that would have horrified her parents. He praised her talent in language that gradually became more personal, more possessive, expressing devotion that crossed every boundary between teacher and student. His voice on the recordings revealed someone who genuinely believed his obsession was love, his control was protection, his violations were expressions of artistic appreciation. During his interrogation following extradition to the United States, Hartwell's delusions became fully apparent. He spoke of Emma with reverence typically reserved for religious figures, describing her musical gifts as transcendent, her potential as unlimited, her death as a tragedy that had robbed the world of unprecedented beauty. He seemed genuinely confused by investigators' suggestions that his behavior had been criminal rather than inspirational. "I gave her everything," he told Detective Chen, tears streaming down his face. "I recognized her gifts when her own parents were too blind to see them. I nurtured her talent, protected her from mediocrity, prepared her for greatness that they would have destroyed with their small-minded provincial thinking." The revelation that Hartwell had been Emma's teacher, trusted by her parents and respected by the community, explained how he had gained access to the Brennan house on that October night. Emma would have opened the door for him without question, would have believed his claims about needing to discuss her musical future, would have trusted him completely until the moment he revealed his true intention. The maestro's Dark Symphony had finally reached its conclusion, but the music would echo through Grand Rapids for generations to come. The extradition of Jonathan Hartwell from the Czech Republic to face charges for the Brennan family murders marked the end of a 20-year fugitive's existence, and the beginning of a legal process that would finally provide answers to questions that had tormented a community for 2 decades. As he sat in the interrogation room at the Grand Rapids Police Department, Hartwell appeared smaller and frailer than the confident music instructor who had once commanded respect from students and parents alike. Detective Chen approached the interrogation with the patience of someone who understood that 20 years of successful dispatching doesn't crumble easily. Hartwell's initial responses were measured, controlled, delivered with the same authoritative tone he had once used to correct student performances. But as evidence mounted and escape routes closed, the careful facade began to crack, revealing the disturbed mind beneath. The breakthrough came when Chen presented Hartwell with the framed sheet music that had been recovered from his Prague apartment, Emma's copy of Pachelbel's Canon, the piece that had disappeared from her collection on the night she died. Confronted with this physical proof of his presence at the crime scene, Hartwell's composure finally shattered completely. "You don't understand," he sobbed, his voice breaking like an adolescent's. "It was never supposed to happen like that. I loved her. I loved Emma more than life itself. Everything I did was to protect her talent, to ensure she achieved the greatness she deserved." The confession that followed revealed the systematic grooming that had preceded the murder. For 3 years, Hartwell had carefully cultivated Emma's trust and dependence, convincing her that their relationship was special, that he alone understood her musical gifts, that her parents' limitations threatened to destroy her potential for greatness. His manipulation had been subtle but relentless. Extra lessons that gradually became more personal, conversations about music that slowly shifted toward intimate discussions of Emma's dreams and fear, physical contact during instruction that pushed boundaries while maintaining plausible professional justification, anonymous love letters that expressed devotion while maintaining distance, creating mystery and excitement that a 16-year-old found intoxicating rather than threatening. "She was responding to my guidance," Hartwell insisted, his delusion apparent even in confession. "Emma understood that I was different from other teachers, that our connection transcended normal student-instructor relationships. She was beginning to see that I could offer her opportunities her parents never could." The October 17th argument with Robert Brennan had destroyed everything Hartwell believed he had built. When the Brennans rejected the European Conservatory opportunity, they weren't just declining an educational program, they were severing the connection that had become Hartwell's reason for existence. Without access to Emma through legitimate teaching channels, his obsession transformed into desperation. "I went to their house that night to make them understand," Hartwell continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone recounting a reasonable conversation, rather than describing the prelude to triple murder. "I explained to Dr. Brennan that Emma's talent was generational, that limiting her opportunities was tantamount to destroying a work of art. But he threatened me, said terrible things about my relationship with his daughter, accused me of things that were beautiful and pure. The violence had erupted when Robert Brennan ordered Hartwell to leave and threatened to call police. Unable to accept rejection, driven by 3 years of unconsummated obsession, Hartwell had struck Robert with a golf trophy from the study bookshelf. The killing had been impulsive, born of rage and desperation, but what followed revealed careful planning and intimate knowledge of crime scene investigation. Linda discovered me trying to reason with Robert, Hartwell explained, his language consistently portraying murder as misunderstanding. She became hysterical, started screaming about calling the police. I couldn't let her destroy everything Emma and I had built together. I couldn't let them take her away from me. The final revelation, Emma's death, shattered any remaining pretense of rationality in Hartwell's world. When Emma found her parents dead and realized that her trusted teacher was responsible, her horror and rejection had triggered the violence that claimed her life as well. She called me a monster, Hartwell whispered, his voice breaking completely. My Emma, my beautiful, talented Emma, looked at me like I was something evil. She couldn't understand that everything I had done was for her, that I was trying to free her from people who would have destroyed her gift. His final act, placing the white rose on Emma's body, represented his attempt to transform murder into martyrdom, to convince himself that he had preserved her innocence and talent rather than destroying them. In his twisted logic, Emma would remain forever young, forever talented, forever. I gave her immortality, Hartwell concluded, his delusion complete, even in the face of life imprisonment. She'll never grow old, never disappoint audiences, never lose the purity that made her special. I preserved her at the moment of her greatest potential. The music had finally stopped, but the echoes would reverberate through Grand Rapids for generations, a reminder of how evil can hide behind the most trusted faces and turn love into the most destructive force imaginable. The sentencing of Jonathan Hartwell to life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole, brought legal closure to a case that had haunted Grand Rapids for 20 years, but justice delivered too late carries its own particular weight of sorrow. The packed courtroom where Hartwell received his sentence was filled with people whose lives had been forever altered by his crimes, survivors seeking peace, investigators finally witnessing resolution, and a community attempting to process 2 decades of unanswered questions.
Detective Janet Kowalski, now retired but still carrying the psychological scars of her obsession with the case, sat in the gallery, watching the man whose crimes had consumed her career and destroyed her marriage. The vindication she had imagined for 20 years felt hollow when measured against the cost of pursuing it. 3 people were still dead, families were still shattered, and the years of investigation had claimed casualties among the living, as well as justice for the dead. The Brennan extended family's response to Hartwell's conviction reflected the complex emotions that surround delayed justice. James Brennan, who had maintained his website and refused to give up hope, felt relief mixed with renewed grief as he finally understood the scope of evil that had visited his family. The knowledge that Robert, Linda, and Emma had been killed by someone they trusted, someone who had been welcomed into their home and their lives, added betrayal to an already unbearable burden of loss. Robert's former patients learned that their dentist had been murdered, not because of his gambling debts or prescription practices, but because he had tried to protect his daughter from a predator who had been hiding behind the respectable facade of music education. Linda's friends discovered that their charitable, loving companion had died defending her family against a threat none of them had recognized, despite years of contact with Emma's instructor. Most tragically, Emma's classmates and fellow musicians realized that their talented friend had been systematically groomed by an adult they had all admired, that her final months had been shadowed by manipulation and obsession that she had been too young and trusting to recognize as dangerous. The violin program that bore her name took on new significance as educators implemented safeguards designed to prevent other students from suffering similar predation. The Grand Rapids music community faced a painful reckoning with the realization that they had failed to protect one of their most promising students from someone who had used his position of authority to groom and ultimately murder her. Music teachers across the region found themselves subject to new background checks, new supervision protocols, and new awareness training designed to identify predatory behavior before it could escalate to violence. The establishment of the Emma Brennan Foundation for Student Safety represented the community's attempt to transform tragedy into protection for future generations. The foundation provided funding for organizations that specialized in identifying and preventing grooming behavior, educated parents about warning signs of inappropriate teacher-student relationships, and supported survivors of educational abuse who had previously suffered in silence. The final memorial service for the Brennan family drew hundreds of people who had been touched by their story over the past 20 years. The youth orchestra's performance of Pachelbel's Canon carried special significance now that investigators understood why that particular piece of music had disappeared from Emma's collection. The melody that had once represented her musical potential now served as a reminder of dreams destroyed by evil, disguised as mentorship. The house at 1428 Maple Street, which had stood empty for years as a monument to unsolved tragedy, was finally demolished to make way for a memorial garden. The rose bushes planted there bloomed white each spring, but now visitors understood the terrible irony of that choice. White roses had been transformed from symbols of purity and innocence into reminders of how predators corrupt the things they claim to love. Detective Marcus Chen, whose technological expertise had finally solved the case, reflected on the lesson embedded in the Brennan murders, that evil often wears the most trusted faces, that predators seek positions of authority specifically because they provide access to victims, and that communities must remain vigilant against those who use their expertise and respectability as camouflage for criminal intent. As Grand Rapids slowly healed from 2 decades of unresolved trauma, the case of the Brennan family murders became a cautionary tale, studied in law enforcement academies and educational institutions across the country. But for those who had lived through the investigation, who had spent 20 years wondering whether justice was possible, the resolution brought a more fundamental lesson about the persistence of truth and the importance of never abandoning hope for answers. The music had stopped forever for Emma Brennan, but her story would continue to protect other young musicians for generations to come. Sometimes the most powerful symphony is the one that echoes in silence, reminding us that evil can be defeated, justice can prevail, and the dead can finally rest in peace when the living refuse to let their stories be forgotten. In the end, that may be the only immortality that matters, not the twisted preservation that Jonathan Hartwell had imagined, but the living memory of a talented young woman whose stolen dreams continue to inspire protection for others who share her gifts and vulnerability.